This is the IBJ podcast for the week of April the 6th, 2020, brought to you by the law firm Krieg DeVault. I'm Mason King. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. I hope you and your family are doing well and that you're getting the rest and exercise and nutrition you need to keep a cool head as we march into the teeth of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're dealing with a lot of fears right now, and one of the worst is fear of the unknown. We're not entirely sure how coronavirus is spread. Many of us could be carrying a coronavirus and not know it. We don't even have a good sense of the number of people who are infected due to the very small number of people who have been tested. It's frustrating. Many of the numbers that we do know are simply terrifying. On Thursday, the U.S. Labor Department reported that 6.6 million Americans filed initial claims for unemployment benefits the previous week. And that was on top of the 3.3 million who filed initial claims the week before. Both of those were records for a single week. And obviously, these numbers are solid indications of layoffs and lost jobs around the country. Indiana was in the thick of it for the week that ended March 28th. 146,243 people filed initial claims for unemployment benefits. Obviously, that's a record. That number was more than double the size of the state record set the week before. Now, Congress and President Trump tried to get ahead of this surge. The $2 trillion CARES Act that was signed on March 27th provides extra relief for those put out of work by the coronavirus. It does a few things. It adds $600 per week to whatever unemployment benefits you might get from your state. In Indiana, by the way, the maximum is $390 per week. Now, that extra $600 per week from the feds will extend for as long as 39 weeks, whereas Indiana's benefit taps out at 26 weeks. And the CARES Act includes a new program called Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, which expands benefits to workers who were previously ineligible, including roughly 16 million Americans who are self-employed, independent contractors like gig economy workers and freelancers. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack here. A lot of the newly unemployed are uncertain about whether they're covered and by which government entity. As we'll hear in a moment, state governments will be administering the federal benefits, and Indiana is still trying to figure out all the details. The sudden surge in unemployed people and benefit applications is overwhelming Indiana's Department of Workforce Development, which is trying to hire dozens of people to meet the demand. And there are questions about how long the state's unemployment fund can last with such a massive influx of applicants. What happens if it runs out of money? To help get a handle on these issues, I spoke with Josh Richardson, Chief of Staff at the Indiana Department of Workforce Development since March 2018. He also served in the department in various capacities during the Daniels and Pence administrations, including nearly 6 years as Deputy Commissioner of Unemployment Insurance Operations. So he's the man for these questions. Here's our interview. Josh, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this is obviously an extraordinary time. I'm sure that you have not had a good night's sleep in probably a month.
Weeks, definitely weeks here. We started to get worried about it, and then for the last few weeks, it's been pretty crazy.
And I imagine that it's also a pretty confusing time. And here is my evidence. And I hate to put you on the spot, but this is on the homepage of the Indiana Department of Workforce Development's worksite. And the first thing you see is a big field of like warning red or pink. And the text says, as Congress passed the COVID-19 CARES Act, a major component is the temporary weekly increase in special provisions for unemployed workers. While plans are being put into place to get the additional relief to impacted Hoosier workers as soon as possible, and this part's in bold, we respectfully ask that you refrain from calling the unemployment insurance call center with any questions regarding the new stimulus package. We don't have the answers yet. Number one, I really appreciate the candor. Can you summarize for us as simply as possible basically what the CARES Act does for Indiana in terms of providing benefits for the unemployed?
Yeah, so it goes in a couple of different directions. One, in terms of traditional unemployment insurance, the one that we've known in Indiana here for decades now, it will add $600 to an individual's weekly benefit amount. And so while we don't have all the details, that's going to be pretty much across the board. If you're receiving a state unemployment benefit amount, then you will have $600 added to whatever your state benefit amount would have been. And that's a federal benefit amount. The second thing that they're doing is they provided an extension of 13 weeks. So in Indiana, you can qualify for 26 weeks of unemployment benefits. They've placed a congressionally funded 13 additional weeks of benefits if a person maintains eligibility. There are some other provisions that are slightly more minor, but by far and away, the biggest one, the one that we're hearing the most about, the one that I think is potentially causing the most anxiety and people in the most confusion at the agency, is that they're passing what they're calling pandemic unemployment compensation. And this is for individuals who don't meet the requirements of the traditional unemployment insurance system because they were not, in fact, an employee. They may have been self-employed or an independent contractor in the gig economy, or may otherwise lack the earnings to qualify for a claim. And that program may provide relief to them. It looks a lot like unemployment insurance, but it's essentially an entirely different program that's just modeled after what we do.
In terms of not knowing the answers, what, from your perspective, are the two or three biggest things that you still need to figure out, you're still looking for answers for?
Okay, yeah. So they're mostly not big picture things, but some of the things with the $600 are really going to be, some of them are inside baseball things, like what happens if the person owes the state money for a previous overpayment or a fraud overpayment? Or what if they owe child support? Those are things that typically we would intercept benefit amounts to cover. And so there's a real question in terms of computer programming about whether that $600 portion of the federal benefit could go to those sorts of offsets. We obviously want to confirm that it applies to partial benefit amounts. So does it apply if the person worked most of the week and only generated $20 in state benefits for unemployment insurance? Do they still get all $600? We think the answer is yes. And so generally we have those. On the pandemic unemployment compensation, so again, it's hard because we talk about these two things together. It's really best to think of them almost as separate programs. But what we really need to know there is what sort of documentation is going to be required in terms of what a person's prior earnings were before we can pay a claim. So, and I can spend just a little bit of time talking about why that matters and why it's so different in our system. So, yeah, so in our system, right, every quarter, employers in Indiana, employers who have employees, right, meaning they meet the definition of a traditional employee, those employers are required to report the amount of wages paid to each person by Social Security number, and they're required to pay a tax on that. And that tax goes into this unemployment insurance trust fund, and it's where we pay state benefits from. So if you're self-employed and you're a hairstylist, we've heard from a lot of hairstylists, if you apply for a state claim for benefits, you're going to be immediately denied because you have no wages. Well, so with this new federal pandemic program, we have to have some substitute for what those wages would be. So, for example, a tax return would be a good one, but maybe you haven't been in the job for very long. And so then you're going to have some sort of a bank statement, or you're going to have some other information to otherwise prove to us that you were in fact working or operating. So in some cases, it may be show us that you were leasing office space, or show us it. So at that point in time, we're talking about an entirely new system of both transmitting information to the agency, and the agency has to review that documentation to calculate a benefit amount. All of that should be spelled out. And so, just to point out again, these programs are federal programs funded with federal money. And so we've got to ensure that we are paying them in accordance with those rules. Otherwise, the state would potentially have some liability for incorrect payments.
And I assume with the speed with which this legislation was passed, there's just a lot of stuff that wasn't worked out ahead of time.
Oh yeah, a lot of stuff that wasn't. And again, some of that burden is on our partners at the Department of Labor to try to fill in those holes. And I know they're doing that. But so we haven't even gotten the guidance from them yet. And so, that doesn't mean we're completely sitting and just refreshing our email box over and over and over again, waiting for it. We have taken some steps based on what we think are reasonable assumptions. But, our IT developers' time right now has become incredibly valuable. And so it's a real struggle to get them to start writing code before we can give them the business requirements that'll be out there. And so it's made it extra challenging.
So we have at least two different pots of money, to my understanding. We have
Sure.
If I have been laid off, I can apply for state benefits. On top of that, there would be the federal benefits that were approved through the CARES Act. Am I right so far?
Yeah, so you're right so far, but again, let's make sure there's federal benefits through the CARES Act for the people that qualify, and then there's an entirely separate program for people who don't qualify for state benefits.
Right. Those are like the independent contractors, for example.
Yep.
Okay, I was going to save the lightning round for the end, but maybe it's better to do it right now. I've got several examples of situations. You tell me whether or not they are eligible. Are you ready?
I am ready. Let me say, we'll do it on the narrow issue you answer. Let me just make the previous disclaimer that everybody has to have the monetary eligibility to qualify.
Right.
And that, obviously when these executive orders lift, but let's do it as the law exists today. And on the narrow issue you talk about, lightning round sounds fun.
Okay.
Let's go.
Here we go. So my company shut down because of Governor Eric Holcomb's order that non-essential businesses close. Am I eligible for state and federal benefits?
You're eligible for state benefits plus the $600 add-on.
Okay, from the feds.
Yep.
What if my company laid people off before the governor's order because business dried up due to concerns about the virus?
Yes, you would be eligible for the traditional program just as you always have. Nothing's changed there.
Okay, and state and federal both.
State plus the 600.
Okay. What if I'm still employed but my hours have been cut? Can I apply for assistance?
So I always try to make sure whenever, because that's a common question, can I apply, can I file? And the answer to that is always yes. Read the questions carefully, answer the questions honestly. Let's talk about cut. So the way that works under state law is when you file your claim, we're going to calculate your benefit amount. We're going to ask you each week, did you work? We're going to answer a yes or no question, right? And then we're going to ask how much you earn. The way that works, and there are some slight variations of the way this works, but the best way to think about it is we're going to deduct from your unemployment benefits dollar for dollar earnings you have in that week. So let's take it's about exactly $300 is the average benefit amount in Indiana. So you're calculated for $350. You get $150 in income, you'd be eligible for the remaining $150 in benefits. So, sorry, this is supposed to be lightning round. This is less lightning-like. So here's the deal. Once you earn more than $300, you generally become ineligible for state benefits. One of the questions that we hope the guidance will provide is, but what about that other $600? Because you potentially could run into the situation where because the person earned $301 in earnings, they lost the opportunity for that other $600. I think that I absolutely believe that it's actually going to turn out that that's exactly what will happen, that they will lose the eligibility for the rest of those dollars because there was no state eligibility to attach it onto. So that's the very non-lightning question, non-lightning answer to your lightning question.
That's fine. What if I have a job but can't work because I'm in quarantine?
Yeah, so that is one of the exceptions that has changed. So under the traditional program, if you removed yourself from the labor market to take care of an illness, you would have been ineligible. Due to Governor Holcomb's executive order, those individuals would now be eligible if they are symptomatic or if they were ordered under quarantine by either their employer or their doctor.
Okay. And again, both state and federal benefits apply.
Yes.
What if I still have a job, but I personally don't want to leave the house because I don't think it's safe?
So this is probably the hardest question that we have in all of them. And so here's the answer. So under our traditional law, when someone quits their job, and that would include sort of not showing up for an extended period of time, the standard in Indiana is, would a reasonably prudent person have felt impelled to quit under the circumstances? So it's a pretty high bar, right? You've got to actually be sort of impelled to quit. And so I think this is going to be one of the toughest ones because unfortunately it's likely to remain on a case-by-case basis. To the extent that the person has no symptoms, has no particular reasons to fear, for their sake, they're not immunocompromised, they're not dealing with that, and they're working in a completely isolated environment throughout the day. Well, maybe a reasonably impelled or prudent person wouldn't feel impelled to quit. Now, on the other hand, if your job is to interact with the public and you're 65 plus and you have some of these health issues that make you particularly high risk, the circumstances could be different. And so my advice, and again, this is turning into not so lightning, but my advice to people is, you've got to do everything that you possibly can to work it out with your employer ahead of the fact. And you've got to make a decision based on your own health and safety. And then we're going to, unfortunately, and this isn't a fun position for us to be in, we're going to have to look at it after the fact and determine whether you've met the standard to be eligible.
Oh, wow.
That's the toughest one.
Yeah. Okay. How about this? And this is topical because today, by the way, this is Thursday, April the 2nd, the state school superintendent announced that state K through 12 schools would be closed for the rest of the school year. Okay, so my kid's school closed and I have to stay home to take care of them. Am I eligible?
Yep. So again, this is an exception to the normal program rules. Normally, in order for someone to be eligible for benefits, they have to be available for work. That includes things like they can find reliable transportation to get to and from work. It also includes making sure that they don't have a barrier like childcare that would prevent them from working. And so under the traditional rules, those individuals could be deemed ineligible. But again, under Governor Holcomb's executive order, they will be fined for collecting benefits.
Now, this might fall under the pandemic group. The people who work in the service industry, like wait staff, whose income is highly dependent on tips. How does that work under the state benefits, and then how under the new federal?
So under our state benefits, under the normal way that would work, one of the most important things that goes on there, and I think that some don't realize, is that the rules are going to be the same for them, right? So whether they're a tipped employee who depends mostly on tips, they're going to be the same. Here's where things get sometimes slightly complicated, is that not everybody reports their tips, and not every employer reports those tips because there is a tax on them. Most people don't think twice about it. It tends to be, I mean, I know that it's clearly not the way that it's supposed to work, but often because those wages go unreported, that when they file their claim, we don't have the records that indicate their earnings. And that does a couple of things. One is it certainly lowers their weekly benefit amount, which is based on their earnings during the year. But it also puts them at jeopardy of being eligible for the claim because they may not have had enough earnings to qualify for an unemployment claim. It's a relatively low threshold, but it exists. And so that becomes somewhat problematic. But I will say that if, to the extent that they meet those tests, then they would qualify to set up a state claim. And as far as we know, will be eligible for the $600 in add-on in federal benefits at that time. And, has been pointed out some in the media and has kind of made some of the news, they could potentially be receiving more in their state unemployment benefits plus the $600 than they earned while they were working, which kind of creates an interesting scenario that we're headed into.
But it's not necessarily disqualifying. That might happen.
Sure. No, it's not. It's not necessarily disqualifying. The other thing is even if they lack the monetary earnings to be eligible for a state claim, there is a chance that pandemic unemployment assistance will apply to them if they fall short of the earnings requirement.
Let's say that I am self-employed. I have my own one-person public relations firm. Normally, I don't think I would be covered by the state, but I am this time.
Yeah. So now don't say state in that one. This one's a little different. This one would be purely, and that is honestly, it's probably the greatest driver of calls to our call center, the greatest driver of frustration right now, is that those people have heard the news that they are now likely eligible for benefits. And so they're logging into our state system, they're filling out the form, and they're getting to a page that says, sorry, you have no employment, you don't qualify, you can't move on, right? Is essentially what they're being told at that point in time. They have no wages upon which to file a claim. So that's correct, right? In our system, that's the right answer. We need to move those individuals over, and we will once we get this guidance, and they should be eligible for the pandemic unemployment assistance.
But still not for the state.
It's still not for the state. It will not change that outcome because, again, there are no wages paid into the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund. There is no eligibility under the state law.
Okay. If I am a member of the gig economy, I drive an Uber, and all my business is dried up because no one's going anywhere. Where are my benefits?
It's exactly the same as your self-employed PR consultant that you just talked about. The same rules are going to apply. Again, the hard thing here is that we're going to have to figure out how to verify their earnings and have a process to move through.
Okay. How about I was already out of work and now I really can't find a job? Am I suddenly eligible?
Well, so maybe. So there are a couple things going on. Now, if you've never worked before, you have no wages and you weren't working and you weren't self-employed, we are not going to be the benefit program for you. There's nothing upon which to set up a claim. You've got to be seeking work. There may be other relief, and I know that sort of the $1,200 stimulus checks that have been talked about, potentially there may be something out there for you, but you have to have been engaged in the workforce to some extent. Now, let's say that you had exhausted an unemployment claim. You've been unemployed now for 26 weeks or more. You had claimed unemployment, but it was gone. That's where, at the very beginning, when you asked me to give you some of the examples of what's in the bill, the additional 13 weeks of federal benefits may kick in and resume your eligibility at that point.
I think you might have just mentioned this, but when I imagine myself being fired, because obviously it's going to happen, and I am sitting at home collecting my unemployment, and I'm thinking, this is great. Now I can go through the entire Criterion collection on Netflix and just enjoy myself for 36 weeks. And then I think, wait a second, am I supposed to prove that I'm trying to find a job? Is that still a requirement?
So it would not be advisable to be doing nothing to return yourself to work. But I would say, for the time being, again, I think based on sort of considerations for public health and based on the considerations that generally we want people to shelter in place, the work search requirements have been waived. So there is no requirement in order for your eligibility for you to spend any part of your day working on, finding a job. Absolutely think it's still the best case scenario that people update a resume, especially if they don't intend to go back to we're seeing the situation where many of these people expect, hey, once this is over, I'm going to go back to exactly the last place I worked. And it'll feel just like, this is a distant memory and that it never happened. But, in the meantime, updating a resume, working on things like updating your LinkedIn profile, some of those things I think could be really helpful tools, not a requirement for receipt of unemployment benefits while this emergency is in place and while the executive order from Governor Holcomb is in effect.
Okay, let's take a quick break from the discussion to hear from our sponsor. This is the IBJ Podcast.
The IBJ Podcast is brought to you by Krieg DeVault, a trusted and dynamic law firm representing a wide variety of local, regional, and national clients. Committed to each other and to every client, Krieg DeVault prides itself on integrity, professionalism, respect, and excellence. Financial institutions, global manufacturers, national healthcare providers, and successful organizations of all sizes and market focus rely on Krieg DeVault to create innovative and successful business solutions. Connect today at www.kriegdevault.com.
All right, we're back with the latest edition of the IBJ Podcast. We're talking this week with Josh Richardson, Chief of Staff for the Indiana Department of Workforce Development, about the surge in applications for unemployment benefits. Okay, lightning round is over. Now I'm going to throw you into the fire.
All right.
So it's Thursday, April 2nd. The stats for the number of people who filed for initial claims for unemployment insurance benefits last week were just released. For Indiana, I think it was 146,243 people filed for the week ending March 28th. And that was up from, I think, 86,000, more or less.
68.
Oh, it was 68. Okay. From the people who, that's right, who filed initial claims from the previous week, which was up from a relatively minuscule number, maybe a few thousand the week before. So I'm assuming that we are in record territory, that 86,000 bump is just something we have never seen before.
Not only have we never seen it before, but there was, it's just completely off the scale. So to give you a bit of perspective, the previous high, I can get the data back to 1987, January 1 of 1987. If you look at the data from there forward, the highest number of initial claims filed was in the second week of 2009. So it was January of 2009, right as we were really getting into the Great Recession. And the previous high water mark was 28,000 claims filed in a week. And so basically, you had this time of history where the possible range was between, sort of 4,000 claims a week and 20,000 claims a week. We had recently gotten all the way down where 2,000 claims a week was pretty normal. And so we're almost at sort of 6 times the previous record in terms of claims filings. And so it's not just we're reaching record territory, it's that I don't know that there would have been any forecast under which we would have imagined that this could occur. And I think we're sort of showing some signs that we obviously weren't seeing this occurring, but we're working very hard to try to adjust.
What industry sectors are these applicants coming from for the most part?
At the very beginning, obviously the very first few days of it was a lot of restaurants because of sort of the governor's orders. But at this point in time, I'm not entirely sure that there's anybody that's been spared. To the extent that industries are really set up around a model that allows people to work remotely or work from home, I don't think that we've seen those, but it really is across the board at this point in time. And, I think that there will be a bit of a ripple effect where we see it move to some of the other sectors that maybe up to this point had been okay. And potentially it'll even, depending on where it goes, maybe it will start to catch some of the work from home folks. But right now, there are a lot of people today that are able to work from home. I can't imagine how different it would have been even 15 years ago to deal with a situation like this. But I don't know that anybody's been particularly spared from it.
So of the 146,000 people who filed the initial claims for this last week, I assume we don't know yet how many were approved for benefits. Is that right?
It's a little bit more complicated than just approved in the sense that, when people file a claim for benefits, the first thing we've got to do is decide whether they were monetarily eligible for them. And many of those individuals will be. The next thing we've got to do is go through that processing point. So we wouldn't actually generate a payment on the people that filed that week until really at the earliest next Monday. Just because there's sort of this 14-day timeline where there are some other things to happen before we can pay out the claim. So I won't have those numbers probably until the middle of next week, where we'll get a much better sense of what percentage are going to be eligible.
You said monetarily eligible a couple of times.
Yeah.
I feel like I know what that means, but explain that very simply.
Yeah, so that's fair enough. So again, that just means that they have earnings in employment that are high enough to qualify for a claim for benefits. And again, those thresholds are pretty low. They get fairly complicated. But I will say that you have to earn a minimum of $5,200. And again, it's more complicated than that. It can't be all $5,200 over the course of 1 week. But if you don't meet that threshold, then you're not going to meet the tests for having been employed long enough to qualify. And so that we know essentially immediately. And again, that's because it's based on reports that your employers have sent to us. That we can tell right away. So we know that part of it. Whether you're going to be eligible in any given week is something we have to reevaluate on a weekly basis. But so a lot of times the first questions you're answering, do they meet those monetary rules? And then does the nature of their separation qualify them for benefits? So again, if you get fired because you did something dumb, or if you quit and you didn't have a very good reason to, you can also be ineligible. But then after that, we've got to look in each week and see, did you work this week? Did you have any earnings? Normally we're looking at, were you able to work? Were you available to work? Were you actively seeking work? We're not looking at those last three right now, but we still have to look at earnings and we still have to know whether you did in fact work during the week.
So every week you are going back, you're doubling back on everybody who's receiving benefits to see whether or not they're still eligible.
Sure, but a lot of that is automated at this point in time. So, in Indiana, we use the term vouchers, but each week a person has to get in. They can do it as early as Sunday because our weeks start on Sunday. So they get in on Sunday and they basically tell us about what happened to them the previous week. So, it wouldn't surprise you to know that, again, in a normal economy, there will be times where a person thinks they're going to be laid off. Maybe even on a Friday, they're told, hey, we're not going to need you next week. But they could get a call by Wednesday of the following week and say, hey, we need you back now. Go ahead and come on in. So they file the claim letting us know that they're out of work. But then each week when the week gets over, they say, yep, I actually didn't work this week. I didn't have any work available to me. I didn't earn anything. And that's what allows us to actually generate the payment because they meet the criteria. So it's a smaller threshold, but so most of that's an automated process. We're going to say, did you work this week? And again, it really is this simple. Did you work this week? Yes or no? If they answer yes, then we're going to have questions about the types of earnings. If they say no, were you able to work? Were you available for work? Did you actively seek work? Right now, their answers to those questions don't matter very much. And because the system has been adjusted to account for the fact that we've really widened the latitude. And so once they get to that point, it's mostly a system handled process. But yes, we do look every week at continued eligibility.
So when are the people who filed last week, when are they going to receive their first checks, most likely?
So they filed last week. So let me look at a calendar here. I've got I have one in front of me. So obviously we're sitting here. You mentioned today, April 2nd, as we're having this conversation. So let's say the person filed on Monday, March 23rd. Was the first day they would have expected to go into work on Monday, and they didn't. So maybe Friday the 20th was their last day of work. So on the 23rd, they log into our computer system. They go to unemployment.in.gov and they register for an uplink account and they file their claim for benefits. Well, what'll happen then is that'll kick off that process. The monetary determination should happen automatically. They'll say that they were laid off due to lack of work, which won't create an issue. We'll send a notice to their employer. Sorry, this is my long answer to your question, but we'll send a notice to their employer. Their employer will have the opportunity to protest and say, They were fired. Again, employers aren't doing that at this point in time. Folks are laid off. So that week then ends on Sunday, which would be the 29th. So it looks like that would be 6 days later. They're going to file their voucher for that previous week and say, yep, I didn't work. Now, on Monday, right, that week is all the way complete, but we likely wouldn't pay yet because their employer has 13 days to protest their receipt of benefits. And most employers don't respond back and say, no, it's true, it was just a layoff. So we wait until that clock runs out. Generally speaking, the earliest that person would see pay would be on Monday, April 6th, if I'm looking at this correct, because they'll wait until they'll file that voucher on the 5th. And then because the waiting period has been waived under Governor Holcomb's executive order, they could potentially receive 2 weeks worth of benefits on the morning of Monday, March 6th. We tell people 21 days. So if you use that math, it could be another week, but many times we'll see payments between the 6th and the 9th there.
Okay. So you're well north of 100,000 applications just for this week. God knows what it's going to be next week. That seems like a lot of either paperwork or online applications to process. How is the department keeping up with the workload? How do you adjust the process?
Well, so, we've never operated, obviously, in an environment like this. It's so, when you just talk about the volume of claims being extensive, but remember, a lot of our folks are working in very different environments themselves. So most of this work is typically done out of a single office building in Indianapolis, and we have, folks on each floor of a 4-story building. And now, we really only have about 20% of our staff that's in the building on a daily basis. And so, they're out trying to do this in different environments, working remotely in a way that we weren't necessarily intended to. I'll say a couple things, though. The system that we use to take the claims has functioned very well throughout this period. Its ability to handle the capacity of the claims has been, I think, pretty impressive. And just a quick Google search, by the way, of unemployment system crashes, you'll get a list of a dozen or so states where they've reportedly had crashes of the system that takes the claim. So we're good there. Our phone system, on the other hand, where really requires human touch each time a person calls, that system has really struggled to keep up with the volume of the calls. And not only have the people struggled to keep up, but even the technology that holds it has struggled to keep up because there are just more calls per minute than what the system was designed to even allow itself to receive. So we've struggled to even give people the pre-recorded messages because there simply aren't enough lines to connect them even to the recorded message. And so that's been a real struggle. And then our people are going to be a real question here too. They obviously, they're going to work very hard at this, but this is more than what they've seen over the period of a week. And it's stressful in the sense that they know very much that there are people that are out there that are waiting on decisions from us and waiting on action from us to receive these benefits. And that can be really stressful on our own staff as they're trying to work through this. I know they feel lucky that they've still got work to do and they understand they're not on the other side, but it is a challenge for them and sometimes emotionally challenging because they're hearing these stories from people who are in sort of desperate situations and the work is never ending right now. But we've got a team that's been rising to the challenge, but I'll tell you, it is difficult on our system. So
did I hear today on the governor's press conference that you are hiring people to do what?
Well, mainly 2 functions. So one is we are hiring for people to work in our call center to actually take the calls, which is a job that we can train and probably get people up and being helpful within days, maybe stretch that out to 2 weeks. We can actually get them on the phone and providing at least basic information to individuals that have it. The other function is the claims investigator or adjudicator role, and those are the people who, when there are exceptions, when the system can't make the decision because we've got to go collect facts from people, that's the second role. That's normally a process where we like to train our people for 6 months or up to a year. Here we've got to figure out a way to speed that up, and so that may be narrowing the types of issues that they're able to look into and look at. But it's really those 2 roles that are what the vast majority of people, what's standing between them and the answers that they need or the benefits that they need are those 2 roles.
So how many more people do you think you need?
Well, so, that totals about 70 people, but it's going to be more than that. But the thing is that we've got to figure out some other solutions. We've also looked at and in fact taken some steps to outsourcing some of the calls, trying to find a call center that's got some capacity to help us at least triage these and route them in the right directions. honestly, at this point in time, when you look at the numbers and the volume that we have, it's hard to imagine that we could truly staff up to take all of these calls at this point. It's hundreds of thousands over the course of a week.
Yeah.
And so we're going to have to figure out some way. What I'd say is that these two things come together, because the reason why people call is because they're anxious or concerned about where their benefits are at. And so if our system is able to do what we think that it will, and it's able to process the vast majority of these cases without requiring human intervention, once people see these dollars hit their bank account, or once they receive them on the debit card, we think that the calls will slow down a bit. And then hopefully that'll happen at the same time we're ramping up. But I think that, we're probably looking at least another couple of weeks here of pretty frustrating times for folks that are trying to get through to a call center, because it's not just about finding a warm body. They've got to know enough to be able to reasonably help that person who calls in, or we're really not providing the level of service that we want to.
Yeah. Now, I know in the previous bit of stimulus that President Trump signed, I think it was the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, there was money in there for states that they could use to, I think, tell me if I'm wrong, deal with this kind of situation.
Right.
Just very quickly summarize, how's that going to help?
So, it's going to help just by providing the funding that we need to do the IT work, to potentially augment our staff, and to make it through the time period. It's potentially $20 million that Indiana can qualify for, and we fully plan to qualify for it. And so it really is. It's just what it allows us to do is to make these changes without being particularly concerned about how we're going to pay for them. That's still a consideration. We still want to make sure that we're spending the right amount of money, and that we're being wise about it. But it does mean that it's not where's the money going to come from. It's just instead, going through the checklist and making sure we've got the best vendor at the best price.
Last bit of questioning. Explain to people, this is a simple one, where the money for state unemployment benefits comes from.
Yeah, so we kind of touched on this just a little bit. So for individuals, anybody who's in employment, an employer is required to pay a tax on that individual, a state unemployment tax, and they pay that based on a couple of things. One is based on your wages. So they pay the tax on the first $9,500 they pay to each employee in a calendar year. And the amount that they pay is somewhat based on that employer's history with the unemployment insurance fund. So if it's an employer who routinely lays people off and whose employees routinely receive unemployment benefits, their rate would be a little higher than someone who's had a very stable workforce for the last decade and hasn't laid folks off. But so they pay that money into the fund, but it's really just a fraction on an individual. So it can be as low as about $50, as high as $700 on an individual. So when you talk about an unemployment claim where we could pay out $390 a week, it doesn't take very long before that employer's contributions end up not covering those benefits. But it comes out of the fund. There's no, it's not like it just runs out of money and we tell people they're out of luck. We're able to fund it well beyond, that employer's contributions. And in fact, there's a process with the federal government where if our fund runs out of money, we can take an advance from them to continue to pay claims. And so we're not in jeopardy of sort of running out of money in the sense that we'll still be able to pay the claims.
Gotcha. As I recall, that happened during the recession. That
it did.
That there were so many claims that I think the state had to borrow, 2.1 billion. $2.1 billion, which it needed to pay back.
Right.
It's not like it's free money.
Yeah. And we had paid it back, and we had gotten to the point where just 2 weeks ago on a Friday, I got a note that we had $870 million in that fund. It's clearly going to take a hit. How much of a hit is going to depend on sort of how long these debts last. It actually will, it'll be okay here for a few weeks, but if this continues to go on and on, it will certainly be stressed.
So I assume that you guys do some kind of modeling, and it's difficult to figure out which inputs to put in. Can you ballpark how long it's going to take before you end up in the red?
Oh boy, I'm not sure that I can, in the sense that we just don't know where it's at. Here's what I'd say again: we got about $860 million in there now. Because the way that tax works, remember, you pay on the first $9,500 that you pay to an employee in a calendar year. A lot of that tax that was accumulated will be owed for the first quarter. Now, we've delayed employers' receipt of those payments. This is my long way of saying that we expect about $200 million more dollars in revenue to come in over the course of 2020, even with the downturn. And so you're talking about $1 billion worth of benefits that we could pay out and potentially say, okay, now, so here's the deal. If 100,000 people collect $300 a week, there's $30 million a week. If 200,000 people, and so this isn't projections, this is just the round math. If 200,000 people collect $300 a week, you're talking about $60 million. And so, you look in that range again, we know that, 68 and then 146 filed, you're going at about $60 million a week at that clip. And so, not that long, but it's months. It's months that we could go. And then we'd look at it, and I tell you, it reminds me a little bit of, I was telling someone this earlier today, the scene where Jimmy Stewart's got the money and he's trying to make sure that he can pay out all the people that come to the bank and It's a Wonderful Life. And I'm thinking at the end of this, we're hoping to have at least a couple dollars left in there that we can leave overnight. So it's going to be tight, but the truth is that the most important thing here is that, Indiana had a really historically low unemployment rates. We had an economy that was operating really well, and it's just all been thrown off by this. The real question is going to be how quickly we can get back to some sense of normal, and sort of what that normal looks like coming out of this. Do we go back to these historic lows? It probably takes a little while to get there. I'm not an expert at deciding those things, but there are scenarios where we could see potentially getting to the other side of this without a huge amount of debt. And we've got a good structure. We know how to build a fund back up. We covered, $3 billion worth of ground over the last decade. And so we'll figure it out. Right now, it's about providing relief to Hoosiers and ensuring that they maintain that purchasing power, because at the other end of this, we want them to be able to go to restaurants. We want them to be able to take vacations, across Indiana. And so we want them to be able to do those things, and the unemployment benefits are the key to doing that. And so we hope to provide that service.
As I recall, the method for kind of getting back to the black on the fund was to raise, I don't know if a tax is the right word, but to raise the amount that the businesses paid in for employees into the fund, and to reduce benefits. Is it possible that could then happen again?
So I really doubt it. I really doubt it, and here's why. Again, and a lot of people forget this. So we borrowed money during the Great Recession, as you mentioned, but what people don't understand is that from 2001 to 2011, we had actually paid out more in benefits each year than we had taken in revenues. The system was sort of structurally broken in that sense. And so there was no path to leaving it alone and digging back out. You can't operate that way for very long. And so in 2011, those big structural changes that were made to benefits and taxes put us on a path where since 2011 all the way through at least 2020, we took in more in dollars than we paid out in benefits. And so we were really able to turn the tide there. Now, what will happen is, just because of some of the fluctuation, employers' rates could go up, but they'll be under the existing structure that's in the statute, and they'll be more like the rates they were paying in 2014 and 2015, and less like today. And again, that's because as these claims go through, it'll lower the balance of the fund, which pushes them up. But the answer to that question is no. I don't think there's going to be any legislative action to change anything needed. It's just going to be a matter of letting the system that was designed work its way out.
Hey, I think I've taken up enough of your time. It's after 5 o'clock. Do you get to go home?
Well, there's only home. There's only home these days. It's the opposite. It's, do I ever get to leave home? But it is work. It's all day long. I think, we've seen the media as an important part of this, in the sense that, again, because we can't answer these calls, doing these interviews is really helpful. And I actually have enjoyed this in the sense that, it is a system that a lot of people need right now that have never used it before. Maybe it's been decades since they used it. They never thought they'd that they would use it, and yet they find themselves here. And so I think trying to provide some level of comfort that, okay, I know how this is going to work, and I can start doing the math about how I'm going to get through it. It's an important function, and I've enjoyed it. So thank you for having me.
Sure. If the one thing that you would need to tell somebody if they want to do more is go to, where would they go?
Yeah, it's unemployment.in.gov. We have tried really hard to deposit all of our resources at that site. They can file their claim from there, but they can also look through the frequently asked questions. If they're really intrigued by this and now they've decided that they want to become a master of the unemployment insurance system, the claimant handbook, which is something that all claimants should read, is a nice document that will really walk them through all the ins and the outs of state benefits. And then, we're looking forward to federal guidance so that we can start implementing these new programs. But we'll post all of that information at unemployment.in.gov, and they can work from there.
All right. Well, thanks again for your time, Josh. I appreciate it.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
My thanks again to Josh Richardson. Before you get on with the rest of your week, I have a dozen stories from the latest issue of IBJ that I think you'll find relevant. We've blown up the typical lineup of the paper to bring you a package of profiles focusing on small businesses that have been impacted by the coronavirus crisis. We ask how they're seeking to persevere and potentially gain a competitive advantage when normalcy returns. Also in this week's issue, Sam Quinn explores how nearly $350 billion in federal money earmarked in the CARES Act could help keep Indiana small businesses going. And Mickey Shuey explains how Indianapolis's major cultural institutions, such as the Indianapolis Symphony Orchestra and Indiana Repertory Theater, are assessing the damage and planning to recover from the big hits they're taking to their operating revenue. You can find all these stories in the latest print edition of IBJ or online at ibj.com. Now, most of our coverage of the coronavirus crisis can be accessed for free on the website for all readers, and that includes our continuously updated digest of all the latest news. It's called The Latest, and you'll see it on the IBJ homepage. And remember, for unfettered access to all of IBJ's award-winning business content from today and yesterday and the previous economic crisis, just hit the subscribe button. Thanks for making time this week for the IBJ podcast, which is edited by Leslie Weidenbender. I'm Mason King. Hang in there, everybody. We'll be back again next week.